"She smells like the moors after rain," said Torvald, king of the grey reaches, and the woman beside him in the dark was not his wife. "You, Sereth, you always smelled of ledgers and lamp oil." Sereth stood in the doorway of the antechamber. She had painted herself 3 winters ago, when she still believed love could be built like a stone wall, one patient course at a time. The words didn't strike her ears so much as unwrite something in her chest. There is a bond that ties a mated pair among the wolf-blooded houses of the north, a living thread strung soul to soul, and she felt it snap. Not tear. Snap, the way a lute string snaps at the height of its tension, a small violent music, and then a silence that rings. Her knees didn't buckle. Her hands didn't shake. She looked at the 2 shapes tangled in the moonlight that fell through the arrow-slit window, her husband's broad back, and the pale curve of a woman she had loved since girlhood, and she understood with a cold and perfect clarity that her life, as she had known it, had just ended. Blood drained from her face and pooled somewhere behind her ribs, heavy as iron. She did not scream. She could have. The whole keep would have woken to it. Guards, cooks, the old steward, the pups sleeping in the west wing. She swallowed the scream the way a drowning creature swallows the sea, and she let it settle. And in its place, she found one single sentence, and she said it to herself in the dark. "Let him keep the illusion. I will keep the truth. And the truth is worth more than any crown he could set upon that woman's brow." Then she stepped back into the corridor before either of them turned, and she closed the door without a sound, and she walked. The stones were cold through her slippers. The torches had burned low, guttering in their iron cages, and her shadow leapt and shrank along the walls as if it too were trying to flee. She had been queen of the grey reaches for 2 years and 11 months. She had negotiated the grain treaty with the river clans that fed 3,000 mouths through the black winter. She had reorganized the treasury after the old master of coin drank himself into the grave, and she had done it so quietly that Torvald believed the gold simply behaved itself under his rule. She had learned every name of every family in the keep, the children, the ailments, the debts. She had built the machine of a kingdom, and the king had never once looked at the machine. He looked at the throne, and he looked at himself upon it. And now he looked at Ylvarn, her dearest friend, the woman who had wept at Sereth's own wedding, who had braided flowers into her hair that morning and whispered that she had never seen a happier bride. Sereth reached her own chambers and did not weep. She lit a single candle. She sat at her writing table, the one thing in the whole royal apartment that was truly hers, brought from her father's house, its surface scarred by a decade of her own pen, and she began very calmly to plan. Because Sereth of the House of Renlo had learned one thing in her 29 years that Torvald had never bothered to learn. She had learned that grief, if you refuse to spend it on screaming, becomes fuel. It burns slow and it burns clean, and it will carry you a very long way from the place that broke you. Outside, the wind came down off the moors, carrying the scent of rain and heather, the scent he had praised on another woman's skin, and Sereth breathed it in and let it harden her. Somewhere below, in the vaults she had spent 3 years quietly ordering, sat the ledgers that only she could read. Somewhere in the eastern provinces, a network of factors and grain brokers and river captains knew her name and not his. Somewhere in a locked chest beneath a loose flagstone in this very room lay a set of documents she had drafted 18 months ago, on a night when she had woken from a dream of drowning, and understood, in the marrow of her, that a woman who builds her entire life inside another person's house had better keep a key hidden in her own pocket. She had told no one she was preparing to leave. She had not been preparing to leave. She had been preparing, the way the competent always prepare, for a world that might one day fail to deserve her. That world had just arrived. She would not meet it with tears. She dipped her pen. She wrote through the last cold hours of the night, and when the candle guttered, she lit another, and the words marched across the page in her small, precise hand, lists and instructions and figures, the architecture of a departure so clean it would leave no wound the kingdom could see until the wound was already fatal. She did not write his name. She did not write Ylvain's. She wrote numbers and routes and the names of loyal people, and by the time the first grey light seeped over the moors, she had a plan folded into 8 pages, and a heart folded into something smaller and harder than it had been the night before. She rose. She washed her face in cold water. She looked at herself in the polished silver mirror he had given her on their first anniversary, and she watched the last of the girl who had loved him drain out of her eyes, and something else take its place. Not hatred. Hatred was loud, and she was done with loud things. What took its place was purpose, and purpose is patient, and purpose does not forgive because it does not bother to remember slights, only debts. She had a great many debts to collect, and she intended to collect everyone, and she intended to do it so gracefully that Torvald would not understand what had been done to him until the mountain was already falling. She pinned up her hair. She dressed in grey, and Queen Sereth of the Grey Reaches walked out to break her own kingdom's fast for the very last time, smiling, serene, already gone. She didn't run. That was the thing that would confound them all, later, when they pieced it together and couldn't account for the smoothness of it. A hunted thing runs, and running leaves tracks. Sereth walked, and she smiled, and she moved through the last 3 days of her queenship like water moving through a channel someone else built, without ever suspecting the channel had been dug for exactly this. On the first morning, she took breakfast with Torvald in the small hall, and he was expansive, ruddy, glowing with the particular warmth of a man who has satisfied an appetite and believes no one saw. He praised the venison. He told her she looked tired. She said the winter accounts had kept her late, and this was true, and he waved his hand and said she worried too much about coin, that a queen ought to leave such things to lesser men, and she agreed with him, and inside her the last thread of pity for him withered and dropped like a dead leaf. Because he did not know. That was the whole of it. He genuinely did not know that the lesser men couldn't read the account she kept, that the treasury balanced only because she balanced it in her sleep, that the grain treaty he thought was a formality was in truth a lattice of promises held together by her name and her reputation among river clan chieftains who despised him and tolerated her. He thought the kingdom ran on his majesty. It ran on her arithmetic, and she was about to withdraw her arithmetic. On the first afternoon, she visited the vaults with the old steward, Master Palland, a stooped and silver-bearded man who had served 3 kings and had long ago stopped believing that kings were the point of anything. He watched her count the sealed chests, and he watched her set aside 3 of them, small ones, unremarkable, and he said nothing until she was done. And then he said, quietly, in the voice of a man offering a hand across a chasm, "The eastern factors sent word. The grain barges are held at Hollowford until the spring writ is signed. Only your seal will move them." She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said the thing they both understood, which was that without her seal, the eastern grain would rot on the water, and the black months would come with empty granaries. And then Master Palund did a remarkable thing. He reached into his robe and drew out a heavy iron key, old, worn smooth by decades of thumbs, and he pressed it into her hand and folded her fingers over it. "The postern gate below the river stair," he said. "It has not been used in my lifetime. The guards do not know it opens. It opens—" She said nothing. Her throat had closed. He patted her hand once, the way a grandfather pats a child, and he said, "I served your husband's father. He was a hard man, but he was not a fool, and a hard man who is not a fool knows the difference between the crown and the head that wears it. You are the crown, my lady. You have been the crown for 3 years. Whatever you are about to do, do it, and do not look back, and do not think of us who stay. We will manage the ruin. We always do." And he turned and shuffled away into the dark of the vaults, and Sereth stood alone, with the key biting into her palm, and understood that she had one ally in the world, and that one loyal witness who sees clearly is worth more than 1,000 courtiers who do not. On the second day she moved money. Not gold, that was too heavy and too traceable, but promises, letters of credit drawn on the great counting house at Merrowgate, under a name that was not her royal name, but was, in the ledgers of that house, entirely and unimpeachably solvent. She had opened the account 18 months ago. She had fed it steadily since, small sums skimmed from her own private allowance, the Queen's portion that Torvald granted her the way a man tosses a coin to a musician, never once wondering where it went. It went here. It went into a name, Wren Halloway, a merchant widow of no fixed county, plausible and dull and beneath notice, and now that name owned enough to buy a ship or a house or a beginning. On the second evening she saw Ylvain. She could not avoid it, and she did not try. Ylvain came to her chambers as she always had, gowned in blue, her hair loose, her face open and warm and utterly untroubled, and she sat on the edge of Sereth's bed and chattered about the coming spring festival, and asked whether Sereth had chosen her gown, and Sereth watched her dearest friend's mouth make the shapes of friendship and felt nothing at all, which was worse than hatred, worse than grief, a numb and total absence where a whole life of love had been. "You seem far away," Ylvain said, tilting her head. "I am tired," Sereth said. "The accounts." "You work too hard," Ylvain said, and reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind Sereth's ear, the small, intimate gesture of a lifetime's closeness, and Sereth let her, and smiled and thought, "You will remember this moment. You will lie awake, and remember that you touched my hair the night before I vanished, and you felt nothing wrong, because you are not the kind of creature that feels the ground shift under a person you have wronged." And Ylvane kissed her cheek and went, humming, back down the corridor to wherever she went now, and Sereth sat very still until the humming faded, and then she rose and finished her packing, which fit into a single leather satchel, because she was taking nothing that he had given her. She left the rings on the pillow, both of them, the betrothal band and the marriage band, set neatly side by side on the white linen where he would find them, or would not, depending on how long it took him to notice she was gone. She left the coronet in its velvet box. She left the gowns, the jewels, the letters he had written her in the first months when he had still pretended, all of it, because none of it was hers. None of it had ever been hers. It had been the plumage of a role she had performed with excellence for an audience of one who had never once truly watched. On the third night, she went down the river stair with the satchel over her shoulder, and Master Palund's key in her fist, and the moon behind cloud, and the postern gate that had not opened in his lifetime opened for her. Silent on hinges she had oiled herself 2 nights before, and she stepped through into the cold and the dark, and the rushing sound of the river, and the gate closed behind her, and the bond that had snapped inside her 3 nights ago went quiet at last, the phantom ache of it fading like the memory of a struck bell. She did not look back at the keep. She had already looked at it enough for a lifetime. She walked to the river, where a small boat waited with a man in it she had paid well and told nothing, and she climbed in, and the current took her east toward Hollowford and Merrowgate, and the whole waiting world, and Sereth of the house of Renlow, who had been a queen and would never be a queen again, watched the black water slide past and did not weep, and did not smile, and simply breathed, and let the moor wind fill her lungs one final time before the river carried her out of the grey reaches forever. 6 months later, in the counting halls of Merrowgate, there was a woman they called the Widow Halloway, and the men who traded in grain and silver and river rights had learned, one by one and then all at once, that it was expensive to underestimate her. She had arrived in the spring with a satchel and a letter of credit, and a way of looking at a ledger that made the clerks straighten in their seats. She had bought, first, a warehouse on the wharf that everyone said was cursed because 3 merchants had failed in it in as many years, and she had looked at the 3 failures and seen at once that the problem was not the building but the rats, not the 4-legged kind, but the 2-legged kind who had been skimming the manifests, and she had cleaned them out with a cold surgical patience that left the guild whispering. She had bought grain when it was cheap because she read the weather in the River Clan almanacs that no city merchant bothered to acquire, and she sold it dear when the late frost came, exactly as she had known it would, and she did not gloat, and she reinvested every coin, and by midsummer the Widow Halloway held contracts that fed a quarter of the eastern provinces, and the great counting house that had once condescended to open an account for a merchant widow of no fixed county now sent its senior partners to her cramped wharf office to ask very politely whether she might consider a partnership. She let them ask. She let them wait. She had learned patience in a stone keep, watching a man ignore her worth for 3 years, and patience had become the sharpest tool in her kit. The woman who emerged from those 6 months was not the woman who had gone down the river stair. That woman had dressed in grey and hidden her competence behind a queen's soft smile. The Widow Halloway dressed in dark green and slate blue, plain rich fabrics that spoke of money without shouting it, and she did not hide anything. She let men see exactly how quickly she calculated, exactly how completely she remembered, exactly how little she needed them. She had cut her hair shorter. She had let the sun of the wharf brown her hands, and she had found, almost by accident, the first person in her adult life who valued her for precisely what she was. His name was Corvin Aldale, and he was the harbour master of Merrowgate, a broad, quiet man of perhaps 40, with a limp from an old dock accident and a mind like a well-kept ledger of his own. He had come to her warehouse the first month to inspect her manifests, expecting to find the usual widow's muddle, and had found instead a system of accounting so elegant that he had stood there turning the pages with something like reverence, and finally said, "Who taught you this?" And she had said, "I taught myself, correcting the mistakes of men who were paid to know better." And he had laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him. And from that day, he had treated her as a colleague, an equal, a mind to be reckoned with, rather than a widow to be managed. He did not court her. That was what she came to trust. He brought her intelligence from the docks, the arrival of ships, the rumours carried by sailors, the shifting prices in ports she could not see, and she gave him her reading of the grain markets, and between them they built something that was not romance, and was, she slowly realized, better than any romance she had known, a partnership of respect so total that it made her old marriage look like what it had been, a performance in a gilded cage. It was Corvin who first brought her the news from the grey reaches. He came into her office on a grey afternoon, with rain streaking the wharf windows, and set down a packet of letters and said, "You follow the northern markets. The grey reaches are in trouble." She kept her face still. She had trained her face for 3 years. It obeyed her. "What trouble?" she said. And Corvin told her. The grain barges at Hollowford had never moved, that first spring, because the writ had never been properly sealed. The Eastern factors, whose loyalty had been to a queen and not a king, had quietly redirected their custom the moment they understood that Queen was gone. The treasury, so long balanced by an invisible hand, had begun to wobble within 2 months, and to list badly within 4. The old grain treaty with the river clans, held together by a name Torvald did not possess, had lapsed, and the clans, sensing weakness, had begun to raise their prices and to whisper among themselves about a king who could not feed his own people. And through it all, Corvin said, the king had married again. A hasty wedding, midsummer, to a woman of the court, and the marriage had not steadied the throne, but shaken it further, because the new queen, it was said, understood nothing of governance and cared for nothing but her own advancement, and the two of them together had spent the winter reserves on a coronation feast while the granaries ran low. Sereth listened to all of it without moving. She had expected some of it. She had not expected the speed, or the completeness, or the strange hollow feeling in her chest as she understood that the machine she had built had been the only thing holding that man's kingdom up, and that in removing herself she had removed the keystone, and the arch was coming down exactly as arches do. "You knew them," Corvin said. It was not a question. He had learned to read her. "I knew them," she said. And that was all she said. And he did not push, and he gathered his letters and told her the barges at Hollowford were up for sale, the whole stranded consignment, cheap, because no one wanted grain they could not get up the frozen northern rivers, and then he limped back out into the rain, and Sereth sat alone in her office and looked at the storm on the water, and felt the long, slow patience in her turn at last toward its object. She could have taken cheap revenge months ago. She could have written a single letter to the River Clan chieftains and collapsed the treaty in a week. She could have exposed Torvald's incompetence in the great markets and watched his credit vanish overnight. She had done none of it. And not out of mercy, and not out of lingering love, but because she had understood something in those first cold nights on the river that had never left her. Cheap revenge is loud, and it is quick, and it leaves you standing in the wreckage with nothing but the wreckage. She wanted more than wreckage. She wanted the thing itself. She wanted to hold the grey reaches in her own hand, not as a queen who had married into it, but as a power who had earned it, so completely that no man could ever again decide her worth for her. And now, she thought, watching the rain, the barges at Hollowford are for sale. She rose, and she went to the map on her wall, the map of the northern rivers she had drawn from memory in her first month here, every ford and rapid and hidden channel she had learned in 3 years of feeding a kingdom, and she traced with one finger a route that no city merchant knew, a spring route, a way to move grain up the northern rivers when everyone else believed the ice made it impossible. She had known that route as a queen. She knew it now as something more dangerous. She sent for Corvin. When he came, she said, "Buy the barges, all of them, in the Holloway name." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he smiled, slow and certain, the smile of a man who has decided to follow someone into a storm because he trusts they can read the wind. "The whole consignment," he said. "The whole consignment," she said, and find me a river captain who was born on the grey reaches and would like to go home rich. And so it began. The grey reaches were starving by the time the thaw came, and King Torvald didn't understand why. He sat in the great hall that Sereth had once filled with the warm, competent bustle of a working court, and he found it cold and thin and full of men who told him what he wished to hear and nothing that he needed to know. His new queen, Maelys, sat beside him in gowns that had cost the last of the winter treasury, and she was beautiful in the way a struck coin is beautiful, hard and bright, and worth exactly its face value, and not a copper more. She had been ambitious at court, and she had been clever enough to catch a grieving king in the confusion of a vanished wife. But she did not know how to read a ledger, and she did not know the name of a single River Clan chieftain, and when the granaries ran low, she suggested a feast to raise morale, and Torvald, who did not know any better either, agreed. They understood, the two of them, only the surface of power, the crowns and the feasts and the bowing, and they had inherited a machine they could not run and could not even see, and the machine had ground to a halt around them without a sound. Torvald's first clear intimation that something was deeply wrong came when the master of coin, a nervous young man promoted far beyond his ability, because the competent old steward Palund had, that spring, quietly retired to a cottage on the moors and could not be persuaded to return, laid a ledger before the king, and could not explain it. "The numbers do not balance, your majesty," the young man said, sweating. "They have not balanced since the spring. I have tried. There are entries here I do not understand. Whole systems of credit and debit that seem to refer to arrangements I cannot find records of, as though someone kept the true accounts in their head and only wrote down the shadows of them." Torvald stared at the columns and saw nothing, because there was nothing to see, because the intelligence that had once animated those numbers had walked out through a postern gate on a moonless night, carrying a leather satchel. "Then hire someone who can understand it," Torvald snapped, and the young man bowed and fled, and no one who could understand it ever came, because there had only ever been one person who understood it, and she was 600 miles to the east reading the weather in a River Clan almanac and buying stranded grain barges under a widow's name. It was Maelys who first spoke the name Sereth aloud, and she spoke it as a taunt. They were arguing, late in the royal apartments, about money, always about money now, and Maelys flung it at him. "You told me she was a dull little accountant who bored you," Maelys said. "You told me the kingdom ran itself. Well, it is not running, Torvald. Where has all the grain gone? Why do the River Clans send us insults instead of barges? You said she was nothing." And Torvald, who had said exactly that, who had said worse than that in a dark antechamber with the moonlight on his back, felt for the first time a cold finger of doubt trace its way down his spine. He did not answer her. He rose and went to the window and looked out over his failing kingdom, the granaries he could not fill, the treasury he could not balance, the treaties he could not honor, and somewhere in the back of his mind a memory surfaced that he had spent 6 months not looking at. His wife, in the first winter, working by candlelight when he had gone to bed, her small, precise hand moving across page after page. His wife, greeting River Clan chieftains by name, asking after their children, brokering with a patience he had found tedious and had left the room to avoid. His wife, saying quietly, on more than one occasion, that the grain treaty was more fragile than it looked and depended on relationships he ought to cultivate himself, and himself waving her away, telling her not to trouble her head, telling her that was women's fussing. He had not listened. He had never listened. He had looked at Sereth for 3 years and seen a competent shadow, a useful piece of furniture, a woman who made the tedious parts of ruling disappear so that he could enjoy the throne. And he had grown so accustomed to the tedious parts disappearing that he had forgotten they were work, forgotten they were done by a person, forgotten that a person can leave. She had left, and the tedious parts had come roaring back like a tide, and he was drowning in them. She was not nothing, Torvald said, to the window, so quietly that Maya-Lis did not hear. And that was the first honest thing he had said in half a year. Meanwhile, 600 miles east, the grain moved. Sereth's river captain, a weathered woman named Greta Orsdotter, who had been born on the grey reaches and had left it young, with a grudge and a talent for cold water, took the barges up the northern rivers by the spring route that no city merchant believed passable, threading the melting ice, running the high water, arriving at the frozen poor villages of the eastern provinces with holds full of grain a full month before anyone thought grain could come. And she sold it, not to the king. Sereth had been very specific about that. She sold it to the villagers directly, to the headmen and the granary keepers, at a price that was fair, that was survivable, that was remembered. And everywhere the barges landed, the story spread ahead of them. A story about a merchant house in the east that had fed the grey reaches when their own king could not. A house whose factor was a river-born woman and whose name was Halloway, and whose true master, it was whispered, no one had ever seen. Sereth built the legend deliberately, the way she built everything, carefully, patiently, with an eye to the long structure of it. She wanted the people of the grey reaches to associate survival with her house and starvation with their king, and she wanted the association planted so deep and so early that by the time she revealed herself, it would already be true in their bones. She did not want to conquer the grey reaches. She had learned in 3 years that conquest is fragile, that a throne taken by force must be held by force forever. She wanted the grey reaches to turn to her, the way a starving man turns to the one who feeds him, freely, gratefully, permanently. And so she fed them, and she waited, and she watched the reports come in on Corvin's grey afternoons, the river clans breaking entirely with the king now, the treasury empty, the new queen's coronation debts unpaid, the young master of coin fled in the night, the great counting houses of the south beginning to refuse the grey reaches credit, because a kingdom that cannot balance its books is a kingdom that cannot repay its loans. And through all of it, the name Halloway rose in the north like a slow tide, and no one in the keep connected the merchant widow who was quietly buying up the grey reaches' debts, its grain contracts, its river rights, its very solvency, with the queen who had left 2 rings on a pillow and vanished into the dark. Torvald sent envoys east that summer, desperate, hunting for credit, for grain, for any counting house that would extend the grey reaches alone against the autumn harvest. They came to Merrowgate, and in Merrowgate they were told, as everyone was told, that there was only one house solvent enough and daring enough to lend to a failing northern kingdom. Only one house that held the grain and the river rights and the credit the grey reaches needed to survive the coming winter, and that house was Halloway, and its master would see them in time if they were patient and if they were willing to meet the terms. Corvin found her on the wharf at dawn, the morning the king's envoys arrived, and he stood beside her a while watching the barges load in the grey light before he said, carefully, "The delegation from the grey reaches is at the guild house. They asked for Halloway. They think they are coming to beg a loan from a merchant widow." He paused. "They do not know who you are." Sereth watched a gull drop and rise over the water. "No," she said, They do not. You could send me, Corvin said. You could negotiate through a factor and never show your face. You could take everything they have and they would never know the hand that did it. He was offering her the safe path, the clean revenge, the checkmate delivered from the shadows. She considered it. It would work, it would be prudent, and it would leave her, again, invisible. The competent shadow who does the work, while a face the world can see takes the credit and the meeting. She had spent 3 years being that. She was done being that. No, she said. I will see them myself. Corvin looked at her sidelong. You're certain? I have been certain for 6 months, she said. Bring them to the wharf office at noon. Do not tell them anything. Let them arrive as beggars. And so at noon, 3 men of the grey reaches, dusty and travel-worn and stiff with the wounded pride of representatives of a kingdom that will not admit it is failing, were shown into the plain, slate-blue office above the wharf where the widow Halloway conducted her affairs, and they found a woman standing at the window with her back to them, looking out over the ships, and the eldest of them, a court functionary named Lord Dremel, whom Sereth had known slightly in her old life, cleared his throat and began the speech he had rehearsed, a speech full of the dignity of the grey reaches and the great honour it would be for a merchant house to assist so ancient a kingdom in a temporary difficulty. He got 3 sentences into it. Then Sereth turned around. She watched it happen across their faces, the slow, terrible recognition, first confusion, then disbelief, then a draining of colour that mirrored her own that night in the antechamber, 6 months and a lifetime ago. Lord Dremel's mouth stopped working. The other 2 envoys looked from him to her and back, not understanding, and then understanding, and the room went so silent that she could hear the gulls and the creak of the loading barges, and the small, dry sound of Lord Dremel's throat trying to swallow. My lady, he said at last, and his voice cracked on it. You're... He could not finish. He did not know what title to use. She was no longer his queen. She was, it was slowly and horribly dawning on all 3 of them, something far more dangerous than a queen. She was the house that held their kingdom's throat. Widow Halloway will do, Sereth said. Her voice was perfectly calm. It was the calm she had learned in 3 years of cold clarity, the calm that lands hardest against a man's rising panic. Please, sit. You came to beg alone. Let us discuss the terms. They sat. They had no choice but to sit, and Sereth remained standing, because standing above them was its own quiet statement, and she let the silence stretch until Lord Dremel broke it, stammering, trying to reconstruct some footing. My lady, we did not know. Had we known you lived, that you were here, the king would have... The king would have what? Sereth said. Soft. Not a challenge. Just a question, offered like a knife laid gently on a table. Dremel had no answer, because they all knew what the king had done. They all knew, or at least suspected, why the queen had vanished. The antechamber had not stayed a secret. The keep had whispered for months. Dremel looked at his hands. The kingdom is suffering, he said finally, abandoning the diplomatic script for something raw. The people are hungry. Whatever passed between you and the king, my lady, the people did not do it to you. The children of the grey reaches did not do it to you. And there it was, the appeal to her conscience, well aimed, because it was true, and because Sereth had spent 6 months feeding those very children through Greta's barges, precisely so that no one could ever say she had let them starve for spite. She let it land. She let him see that it had landed. Then she said, I know. That is why they have eaten all spring while their king feasted. The grain that saved the eastern provinces this winter came up the northern rivers in Holloway barges. Ask your headmen whose name they blessed over their bread. It was not Torvald's. Dremel flinched. He had heard the stories on the road east. He had not, until this moment, understood that the woman before him was the story. "Then you will help us," he said, grasping. "You will lend the grey reaches the grain and the credit to survive the winter." "I will not lend anything to Torvald," Sareth said. "Not a barge, not a copper, not a grain of wheat." The three men went still. This was the ruin they had feared, the door closing. Dremel opened his mouth to plead, and Sareth raised one hand and stopped him, and said the sentence she had been building toward for 6 months, laid it down flat and quiet and final. "I will not lend it, but I will buy it." The silence changed its quality. Confusion again, then a slow dawning that this was not a refusal, but an offer, and a far stranger and more dangerous offer than any of them had come prepared for. "Buy." "What?" Dremel whispered. "The debt," Sareth said. "All of it. I already hold most of it. I have been buying the Grey Reaches obligations from the southern houses since the spring. The grain contracts, the river rights, the loans against the autumn harvest that Torvald cannot repay, because there will be no harvest worth the name. Not without seed grain I control, and river roots I control, and a treaty with the river clans that only I can restore, because I built it, and only I know how it holds together." She let them absorb it. She watched Dremel do the arithmetic she had done months ago, watched him arrive at the sum. "The Grey Reaches is insolvent," she said. "It has been insolvent since summer. It is being kept alive on credit. And I am now, as of 3 weeks ago when I purchased the last of the southern paper, the sole creditor. Which means, my lords, that I do not need to conquer the Grey Reaches. I do not need an army. I do not need to lift a sword or spill a drop of blood. I need only to call in the debts I hold, all at once, and the kingdom will fall into my hand like an overripe fruit, and there is not one thing your king can do to stop it, because he does not have the money, and he does not have the friends, and he does not have the one thing he threw away on a moonless night without even knowing its worth." Dremel's face was ash. "What do you want?" he said, and it was no longer the voice of an envoy. It was the voice of a man who has understood he is not negotiating, but receiving terms. "I want to come home," Sareth said, "on my terms, and I want Torvald to be the one to ask me." The message that went north was short, and Sareth wrote it herself, and it did not threaten, and it did not gloat, which was precisely why it terrified. It stated plainly that the House of Holloway held the entire debt of the Grey Reaches, itemized in an appended ledger so exact and so complete that its very thoroughness was an act of intimidation, and that the House of Holloway was prepared to forgive that debt, to restore the grain, to reopen the river routes, and repair the treaty with the clans, on one condition, which was that the master of the House of Holloway be received at the keep, in the great hall, before the full assembled court, to discuss the future governance of the Grey Reaches. It did not name the master. It did not need to. By the time the message reached Torvald, half the north already knew, because Sareth had made sure it would. She had let the story of the vanished queen and the risen merchant flow together in the taverns and on the wharves and in the mouths of the river captains, so that when the king read the letter, he read it against a rising tide of rumor that had already told everyone in his kingdom the truth he was only now being forced to confront. He read it alone. He had dismissed even Malis. He sat in the cold great hall with the itemized ledger in his hands, and he turned the pages, and on every page he saw the small, precise hand he had spent 3 years failing to value, and he understood, at last and completely, exactly what he had done. He had stood in a dark room and told another woman that his wife smelled of ledgers and lamp oil, and he had meant it as contempt, and he understood now that ledgers and lamp oil were the smell of the only thing that had ever kept him on his throne. He had traded the architect for the ornament. He had thrown away the keystone to make room for a gargoyle, and the keystone had gone east and built an arch of her own, and now she was coming back to pull his down. Maelys, when she learned the terms, didn't understand them, because she never understood the arithmetic, and she raged, and she demanded that Torvald refuse, that he throw the merchant's envoy in a cell, that he raise the levies and march east and take by force whatever this upstart house had stolen. And Torvald looked at his second wife, his bright, hard coin of a wife, and he saw for the first time with total clarity that she was exactly the mistake Sereth had let him make, decorative and hollow and utterly useless in a crisis, a woman who could imagine solving a debt with a war because she did not understand what either a debt or a war actually cost. "There is no army," he said tiredly. "There is no money to pay an army. There is no grain to feed an army. There are no river clans to guide an army north. She holds all of it. She has held all of it since the spring, and I didn't see it because I never saw her, not once, in 3 years." Maelys stared at him. "You are afraid of her," she said, and it was an accusation. "Yes," Torvald said. It was the second honest thing he had said in a year, and it cost him more than the first. The court assembled on the appointed day. Word had spread. The hall was full. Lesser nobles who had not come to court in months arrived to witness whatever was about to happen, because everyone now understood that something was about to happen, and that it would decide the fate of the Grey Reaches. And old Master Palund came in from his moor cottage, walking slow on his stick, and took a place at the side of the hall with a small private smile that no one else understood. The great doors opened at noon, and Sereth came home. She did not come as a supplicant, and she did not come as a conqueror. She came as herself, in dark green and slate blue, plain and rich, her hair short and her hands brown from the wharf, and she walked the length of the great hall she had once filled with her invisible labor, and the assembled court did not know at first who she was, because 6 months and a new life had changed her, and then the recognition rippled through them the way it had rippled through the 3 envoys in her office, and a sound went up, a collective indrawn breath. A name whispered and passed hand to hand down the length of the hall. The Queen who vanished. She reached the foot of the dais where Torvald sat, and Maelys beside him. And she stopped, and she looked up at the man who had discarded her. And for a long moment no one spoke. Torvald's face was a study in ruin. He had rehearsed things to say, apologies, appeals, commands, and every one of them died in his throat when he saw her, because he saw at once that none of them would work, that the woman before him was not the woman he had married, that the soft, competent shadow had gone east and come back as something with edges, something he could not command and could not charm and could not, this time, ignore. "Sereth," he said. His voice was hoarse. "Widow Halloway," she corrected gently, and the correction went through the hall like a blade. "I put down the name Sereth when I put down 2 rings on a pillow. I have earned a new one since." "You." He stopped, started again. "The debt, the ledger, all of it." "It was you." "It was me," she agreed. "It has always been me." "That was rather the point that you never grasped, Your Majesty. It was always me. The treaty was me. The treasury was me. The grain that fed your people this winter was me. Moving up rivers you did not know existed while you feasted on the reserves I had spent 3 years accumulating. You looked at a kingdom that ran, and you thought it ran because you were king. It ran because I ran it. And then I stopped. Maëlys half rose from her seat. How dare you speak to the king like— "Sit down," Sereth said, without even looking at her, and the 2 words carried 3 years of a queen's authority and 6 months of a merchant lord's. And Maëlys, astonishingly, sat, and the hall saw her sit, and something shifted in the room, a recognition of where the true power now lay. Sereth let the silence do its work, and then she turned back to Torvald. "You sent envoys to beg a loan," she said. "I do not lend to men who cannot honor their debts. But I told your Lord Dremel the truth, and I will tell you the same. I did not come to ruin the Grey Reaches. I came to save it. The distinction is that I intend to save it from you." Torvald's hands gripped the arms of the throne she had propped up for 3 years without his ever noticing the props. "You mean to take the crown," he said. "I mean to take what I built," Sereth said. "The crown is a piece of gold. I have no use for a piece of gold. I have plenty of gold now, more than this kingdom has seen in a generation, and I earned every coin of it in the open, in daylight, in a name that was mine. What I want, Torvald, is the thing you never gave me in 3 years of marriage. I want the authority that matches the work. I want to govern the Grey Reaches in fact and in name, and I want you to hand it to me freely before this court, because it is the only way the kingdom survives the winter, and because you owe it, and because you know you owe it. And if I refuse," Torvald said. It was not defiance. It was a man asking to hear the shape of his defeat spoken aloud. "Then I call in the debt," Sereth said. "All of it. Today. This hour. The southern houses will foreclose on the Grey Reaches the way they foreclose on a bankrupt merchant, and there is no law and no army and no god that can stop them, because the paper is legal and the debt is real, and you cannot pay it. The kingdom will be dismantled and sold for parts to satisfy creditors, and you will preside over the auction of your own inheritance, and the people you failed to feed will remember that their king lost the Grey Reaches at a counting table because he could not read a ledger. Or," she let the word hang. "Or," Torvald whispered. "Or you abdicate," Sereth said, "in favor of the House of Halloway. You sign the charter I have brought with me, drawn up by the finest lawyers in Merrowgate, unbreakable, complete. You cede governance of the Grey Reaches to me. The debt is forgiven the moment you sign. The grain flows north within the week. The treaty with the river clans is restored, because I will restore it. Because they will treat with me as they never treated with you. The kingdom lives. The people eat. And you." She paused. And here at last there was something in her voice that was not quite mercy, and not quite cruelty, but something colder and cleaner than either. "You walk out of this hall a free man with your life and your title stripped, and you go somewhere small and quiet, and you spend the rest of your years understanding exactly what you threw away in a dark room on a moonless night." The hall was utterly silent. Every eye moved between the fallen king and the risen woman, and every soul in that room understood that they were watching not a coup, but a reckoning, a debt of a different kind being called in. The debt a proud man owes to the person he was too proud to see. Torvald looked down at her for a long time, and then, slowly, terribly, he began to understand that there was no move on the board that was not the move she had already made for him. He had built the gallows, 3 years of it, one careless dismissal at a time, and she had simply bought the lumber and let him climb. "The charter," he said. His voice had gone flat, hollow, the voice of a man reading his own sentence. "Bring it." Master Palland brought it, walking slow on his stick, and there was that small private smile again, and Sereth understood the depth of the old steward's loyalty, that he had known this day would come from the moment he pressed the postern key into her hand, that he had waited for it, the way one waits for a dawn one has earned the right to see. He laid the charter on a table, and a clerk brought pen and ink, and Torvald descended from the dais he would never climb again, and stood over the document that ended his reign, and he read it, all of it, every clause, because for once in his life he understood that reading the fine print mattered, that it had always mattered, that a woman had tried to teach him so for 3 years while he waved her away. And then Milas rose, and this time no one stopped her, because she no longer mattered enough to stop. "You are giving it to her," she said, disbelieving, shrill. "The kingdom. You are handing our kingdom to your discarded wife because she frightened you with numbers on a page. You are a coward, Torvald. You are a coward and a fool, and I married a throne and you have thrown it away." And Torvald looked at her, his bright, hard, useless coin of a wife, and he said, very quietly, the truest thing of all. "I married a throne too," he said. "That was always my mistake. I married thrones and crowns and appearances, and I let a real woman do the actual work of ruling and called it fussing. She built all this. You spent it. And now she has come to take back what she made. And I cannot even be angry, because she is right. And I have known she was right for 6 months, since the day the ledgers stopped balancing, and I finally understood what balances them." He signed. The pen scratched across the charter in the silence of the hall, and when it was done, there was no thunder and no trumpet, only the small dry sound of a nib lifting from paper, and the grey reaches passed from a king who had never earned it to a woman who had built it, cleanly, legally, permanently, without a single sword drawn. Maelis fled the hall in tears, or in fury, or in both, and no one watched her go. She exited the story the way the decorative always do, unmourned, into a disgrace of her own making, and the court never spoke her name again. Torvald straightened. For a moment, something of the man he might have been flickered in his face, some late, useless dignity. "What will you do with me?" he said. "Nothing," Sereth said. "That is the mercy. I could ruin you. I could try you before the court for the reserves you squandered while your people starved. I could make an example. I will not. You will keep your name and your freedom and a modest pension drawn on the treasury I am about to make solvent again. And you will live out your days somewhere with a good view and a quiet house, and you will have exactly what you always wanted, Torvald. You will have leisure and no responsibility, and no one asking you to trouble your head with ledgers. Enjoy it. You paid a kingdom for it." And that was the cruelest and the kindest thing she could have said, and he understood both edges of it, and he bowed to her, deeply. The bow a subject gives a sovereign, and he walked out of the great hall of the grey reaches, and out of the tail of it. And Sereth watched him go without triumph and without grief, only with the quiet steadiness of a woman who has finally been paid a debt long overdue. Then she turned to the assembled court, and she said, in the clear, practical voice she had used for 3 years to make a kingdom run, "The grain moves north within the week. The River Clan chieftains will be received here at the next full moon and treated with respect, and paid what they are owed. The treasury will be audited openly, and anyone who has been skimming it will find that I read ledgers rather well. Master Palund resumes his post as steward, if he will have it." The old man's smile widened, and he inclined his head. "And the house of Halloway becomes the house of the Grey Reaches, and its master becomes your sovereign, not by marriage, not by birth, but by the plain fact that she is the only one among you who ever knew how to keep you all alive." She let that settle over the hall, and one by one, then in a slow gathering wave, the court knelt, and Sereth stood at the foot of an empty dais she had no intention of sitting upon idly, and she did not smile, and she did not weep, and she simply began, at once, to work, because the granaries were low, and the winter had been hard, and there was a kingdom to feed. Corvin came north within the month, and he did not court her still, and she found that she was ready at last to be the one who reached across the space between them, and what grew there was not the plumage of a role, but the quiet, true thing she had never had, a partnership of equals who valued each other for exactly what they were. The Grey Reaches flourished under her, not because she was kind, though she was fair, and not because she was ruthless, though she could be, but because she was competent, and she was present, and she looked at the machine of the kingdom and saw the people in it, every name, every ailment, every debt, the way she always had, back when no one had bothered to see her. And Torvald, in his quiet house, with its good view, lived long enough to hear the stories drift in from the wider world of the Grey Reaches grown rich and steady and just, of the merchant queen who fed the north, and he understood, more completely with each passing year, the exact dimensions of what he had thrown away in the dark, and that understanding was the whole of his punishment, and it was enough. Here is what the story leaves behind. For anyone who has ever been the shadow doing the work while someone else wore the crown, your worth is not granted by the person who holds power over you. It is not theirs to give, and it is not theirs to withhold. It is built, quietly, in the ledgers no one reads, and the treaties no one thanks you for, and it is proven the day you walk out the postern gate and let the arch fall behind you, and it is reclaimed on your own terms, in your own name, in the daylight. Loyalty cannot be bought, and it cannot be commanded, and a man who mistakes an architect for an ornament will one day stand in the ruins of everything she built and finally learn her name. If this story moved you, if you felt that snap of the bond and that slow, cold turn toward justice, do this before you go. Give it a like, so the story finds the next person who needs to remember their own worth. Share it with someone you know who has been underestimated, who has been the quiet keystone in someone else's careless arch, and tell them you thought of them, because that reminder might be the thing that carries them to their own postern gate. Subscribe and join us, because this is a place for stories about people who were discarded and came back ruling. And tell me, in the comments, the moment you would have walked away, the exact line that would have snapped the bond for you, because I read everyone, and I believe every one of you has a Halloway in you, waiting for the moonless night that sets you free.